going to hear from Lauren Rosenthal, who is an independent reporter and podcast producer, who was the host and lead reporter and producer for the second season of the terrific American Public Media podcast, In Deep. If you haven't listened to it, we'll hear a taste of this morning in just a minute. For that season of In Deep, Lauren went to Lake Charles, Louisiana, where she looked at what happened in the aftermath of a series of devastating storms that hit the area. 2 hurricanes, an ice storm, flooding, and what the people who were relying on federal assistance to help get through the aftermath of those storms saw, the rude awakening that they were in for. Much of the available help came from folks like Roishetta Sibley Ozane, who is the founder, director, and CEO of the Vessel Project of Louisiana, also the Clean Energy Organizing Director with Healthy Gulf for the Southwest Louisiana and Southeast Texas region. She leads fellow alumna, the Environmental Justice Organizer for the Power Coalition for Equity and Justice, and has many other credentials that we will get into this morning. But before we get into the conversation, let's get a little taste of In Deep.
Lake Charles, Louisiana.
Try to catch you some supper, but you don't always be successful.
Threaded through with creeks and bayous and an hour drive from the Gulf Coast.
Our whole way of life revolves around water.
Back in 2020, I heard that Lake Charles was having a bad year.
Lake Charles, Louisiana, getting over a foot of rain in just 24 hours.
A horrible year.
And this is not a bad dream. These are the cards that we have been dealt.
2 huge hurricanes in a matter of weeks, then an ice storm, then a flood.
The most surreal thing I've ever experienced in my life. All of our floors are crunchy, all my rugs are ruined, our bed is ruined. This is everywhere. There's not a single part of town that I've laid my eyes on or passed through that doesn't look like this.
We're gonna have to throw it all away. Everything is gonna have to go.
People hadn't finished cleaning up from one catastrophe, and the next one hit.
I can make out like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 roofs with blue tarps. 8, 9, 10, 11, 12.
The federal government promised help. 2 presidents promised help, but help wasn't getting to people.
They tell you to find a place to live, but everything is destroyed or way out of your price range.
More than a year after the disasters, people were still looking for places to live.
I was in a tent. Who is additional rental assistance for? If it's not for people that are stuck in tents.
And I could see this wasn't just Lake Charles. This could happen anywhere. It will happen in other places.
It doesn't take a lot of imagination to understand that the challenges that we are seeing today are the very types of events that we expect to become more intense and more frequent in the future.
As climate change brings more disasters, our systems for rebuilding are going to fall short. They'll be overwhelmed. I'm Lauren Rosenthal, and this is In Deep, a podcast from American Public Media. This season, we go to Lake Charles.
So Lauren, what led you to Lake Charles? Why did you choose this community, and what did you find when you got there?
Yeah, so I moonlight as a public radio newscaster, and I was seeing headlines come over the wires in 2020 about life-threatening storm surge in Lake Charles in southwest Louisiana as a result of Hurricane Laura. And then just a few weeks later, I saw the headlines about another hurricane headed for that exact part of the country. And the news of what happened next was totally buried in this deluge about the presidential campaign and the pandemic. Really important events. They deserved the coverage, but I just could not shake the feeling that something really big was happening here that had implications for other communities in other parts of the country, and we needed to pay attention to that. So, the more that I looked into what had happened in the region, I kind of focused on Lake Charles because it's a smallish city of about 80,000 people. It sits smack between Houston and New Orleans, and it just seemed like a really interesting, dynamic place with some really deep-seated inequity, really stark patterns of residential segregation and income inequality. And I was concerned because, some of the research I'd done suggested that the recovery process was at a real risk of making that worse. So we picked Lake Charles. We started our reporting remotely because of the pandemic, and as soon as I could get vaccinated, I got on a plane. And we spent 5 weeks there in the spring of 2021.
Yeah. So a lot of people expect storms hit. They render your home uninhabitable, and the cavalry will come. The federal government will come in with aid and assistance and help you out. A lot of people were in for a surprise. What actually, what did you find when you got to Lake Charles?
I found a lot of frustration and a lot of confusion because to people who are familiar with dealing with the aftermath of disasters like hurricanes happen in Southwest Louisiana, floods happen, it felt like something had shifted. And the deal that people were used to, you know, like when something really goes wrong, FEMA will have my back. My insurance company will have my back. That was not the case at all. And I'd like to hear what Roishetta has to say.
So Roishetta, you have been on a journey, it's fair to say. First, where were you when this devastating series of storms hit? Where were you in your life? Like, what was your experience?
Well, I was where everyone was in 2020, in the midst of a global pandemic. I'm a single mom of 6. I had, you know, just like everybody else was at home because we couldn't be at work, and I had COVID myself. And so the news came on that this storm was coming and it was going to be devastating, it was going to be catastrophic, but I was too busy trying to get well. Like I had COVID really bad, and I had to make the choice of being in the hospital and worrying where my kids would be or recovering at home. So I was quarantined in my bedroom, and my children were in the other part of the house. And, I was like, we're just going to have to ride this out. I can't go anywhere. I have COVID. Everybody was deathly afraid of COVID at the time. And they had added like masks and hand sanitizer to hurricane preparedness kits and everything. And so I was just going to ride it out with my children. And then Ben Terry, our local meteorologist, shot a video that's famous and it's gone viral now of him like saying, "Bye, Lake Charles, I'm out of here." And so I was like, wait, the newsman leaving? Maybe we need to leave too. And so, but like everybody else, like many other American citizens, I didn't have any money. We had all gone out and bought all the tissue. So we had spent all our money on tissue paper. And so I didn't have any money to adequately evacuate with 6 children to get gas and to go far enough away from the hurricanes. And so I just got on Facebook like, who all leaving? Y'all leaving? Did y'all see Ben Terry's video? And everybody's like, I'm out of here. If he leaving, I'm leaving. I'm going where Ben going. And so I'm originally from Mississippi. And I was like, well, I'll go home to family. But it's my grandmother who lives there. She's 78 years old. And she's like, one of those people that y'all have seen in the viral videos who's spraying Lysol on their whole body and wearing a fishbowl over their head. She was like, "You're not coming here." And so we started that journey with the gas that I had in my car, and I saw like this lady that I knew from church posting like, "Anybody need gas to evacuate?" And I was like, "Me," and immediately she sent money to my Cash App, and that thing stuck with me forever. And so I went to the closest hotel I could get to in Mississippi and kind of quarantined, didn't tell the clerk. I had my oldest daughter check us in, and I didn't tell them that I had COVID, and we just went in that room and quarantined until my period was over. And that's where we spent that first part of that evacuation.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the Vessel Project, how you got it started, what motivated you to do it, how you did it?
Right. So that thing with her sending me that money, immediately I had a need. I knew I had a need. I didn't know where to go to get that money. She made a post and immediately she sent it to me. It stuck with me. I was like, why doesn't the government work like this? Like, why aren't we just meeting people's needs immediately and efficiently? This is the need, here's the money, the need is met, let's move on. And so I started doing it. Once I was well enough, and I went from Mississippi to Texas because everybody was like, go to Texas, that's where they're offering help for hurricane evacuees from Louisiana. And then we came to Houston because Houston is close to home. And Houston was like, no, get away from here. You know, the hurricane might come here next, and we don't want to give y'all our resources because we need them ourselves, so go to Dallas. And I was like, wait, I am not going all across the world looking for assistance. I'm going to stay right here in Houston. And so my children and I stayed in Houston in a hotel room for 4 months. But while we were in that hotel, I reached out to all the local churches. And you know, at that moment in my life, I was like, it is so hard to get assistance. You know, I'm a single mom of 6. We're basically living in my van. I'm having to figure out how to pay for a hotel room every day. FEMA is not helping quickly enough. It's so much red tape. They want you to produce a birth certificate that was in a home that's completely destroyed. Where am I supposed to get this birth certificate from? And so they wanted to know, do you own the house? Do you rent the house? And if you rent the house, then you have to go in this category. And there was so many things, and I was like, this is not working. So I started posting, you know, questions on Facebook. Who else is having this problem? Who else is going through this? How can I help you? Have you filled out your FEMA application? I can assist you. Even though I didn't have help, I've always been the type of person who learns hands-on. So I felt like the more applications I did to help people, the more I would learn, until eventually it turned into me reading FEMA's whole manual and calling FEMA like, nope, on page 25, you said this is how this goes. And so that's what it turned into. And then I started doing FEMA appeals, and I was kind of like just doing this undercover. And then I started having to make posts that say, hey, disclaimer, I don't work for FEMA, because people started calling FEMA saying, well, one of your workers, she told me. I was like, I don't work for FEMA, baby. I'm just helping you. And so that's kind of how it started. You know, it didn't have a name. I was just helping people with whatever they needed. And I continued to see these posts that said that there were people sleeping in tents and sleeping under bridges. And I was like, in Lake Charles? I was like, no, it's no way people are sleeping under the I-10 bridge. That bridge is like 25 years past the date it's supposed to have been rebuilt. 2 or 3 presidents have promised to rebuild it. It could fall in any minute, and you're telling me people are sleeping under there? No, let me go see. And so I went to check it out, and during this time, a freeze was predicted. And I was like, wait, we've had Laura, we've had Delta, and now here comes a freeze. People are not recovered. People need more than assistance with FEMA, because apparently FEMA isn't working fast enough. And so that's when I started offering emergency shelter. And we had just got the stimulus money. Like I said, I have 6 children, so y'all know I had a big bankroll. And and thank you for that. So I used that stimulus money to start paying for people to have hotel rooms. And again, just kind of doing it undercover. Not really, because, you know, Facebook, everybody knows what you're doing. I was like, who needs a room? And as I was doing it, other people from the community were like, we see you paying for hotel rooms. How can we donate? And they started sending money to Cash App, PayPal, Venmo. And during that freeze, we ended up putting over 300 people in hotel rooms from Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas.
So you were in Houston doing that organizing. Yeah.
No, at this time, I had actually gone back to Louisiana, and I was living in my damaged home.
Okay.
So I was living in a home with a hole in the roof. The tree had been removed, but where the tree had fallen was still indented and was still exposed to the elements. My back door, I didn't have a back door. I think when Lauren came, there was still no back door. It was like boarded up or something.
Yeah.
And we couldn't use the kitchen sink or the bathtub because the bathtub was full of mold. And in my mind, I had sectioned the house off well enough for 7 people to live in this space of the house so that I could help people who needed help in my community.
Yeah. When you said folks from the community, is that Lake Charles? Was it the surrounding areas, the whole region?
It was originally folks from Lake Charles, and then it kind of grew because that freeze affected more than just Lake Charles, of course. It impacted people way in Texas and, parts of Mississippi. But as I was getting those calls for help, I was realizing that a lot of the calls for help that were coming from Texas and Mississippi and Georgia were Lake Charles residents who were still displaced from Laura and Delta. that's just where they had landed. And they were telling people that they knew in those communities, hey, this organization, all you do is call and they pay for you a hotel immediately, and the word just started spreading. And as the word spread and we just started like this network, there was one situation where a guy in Dallas was in a home with his elderly grandparents, and it was freezing, and you could hear the trembling in his voice. And I was like, I can send you money for a hotel, but you need to get to a warming center. You know, I was very concerned with the elderly people that were there, so I ended up calling the Dallas Fire Department. They went over to the house and they, you know, picked them up and they got them to a warming center. So it was things like that. It wasn't always just paying for people a hotel room or monetary assistance. Sometimes folks needed just somebody to listen to them or somebody to connect them to resources in their community. So it just became like I don't know, this type of snowballed into this, you know, networking from Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi. Money was coming. At one point, we were like, we have $0, but we have like 8 people who need this. And then somebody would call in and be like, well, can we donate $5,000? And we were like, where are you from? You know, so we didn't know. It was just people. It was just people power working the way that we assumed the government was supposed to work in the face of disaster.
Lauren, what was FEMA doing during this time? How were they responding?
So I think people have this image of like FEMA as the cavalry, but FEMA is the most visible footprint that the government has in a community after a disaster, but they don't have all that much power or really funding to do all the things that people need. So FEMA was working on making trailers available, but in the end, they made way fewer available than they had during previous storms that have hit the region. And that's partly because, especially after Katrina, FEMA does not want to be in the business of directly housing people. And so what ends up happening is that folks need a short-term place to stay so that they can still be in their community, close to their schools, close to their jobs. And they end up turning to mutual aid organizations and churches and people like Roishetta to get that stopgap help that they really badly need. So FEMA's hands were tied in a lot of ways, but there were also delays and red tape that I think, looking back, the agency regrets and is trying to figure out how to do better in the future.
Yeah. So Roishetta, you got a crash course in mutual aid. What did you learn?
You know, and I'm still doing this today. I'm still helping a lot of the families today. What I've learned is that if we put people first and we stop using our own individual definitions of emergencies, then we can help people much faster, because your emergency may not be my emergency. You know, yes, FEMA provided trailers, very few, but for myself, you know, and I can talk about myself in this case, with my 6 children, we received a FEMA trailer to move into, but at first when I called FEMA to get the FEMA trailer, once they were like, trailers are available, and I told them that I was living back in my damaged house, they were like, oh, well, you don't qualify. If you're living in the damaged dwelling, you don't qualify for assistance. And I was like, well, where do you suggest I live? And the worker on the phone said, this is off the record. And I said, you're probably being recorded. And she said, well, listen, you can put that you slept on the concrete last night and you'll get help faster than you sleeping in your house.
Wow.
And so I started having to navigate like that with the people that I was helping, saying, please don't tell them that you live at your house or that you're living in that. You can be living anywhere else. You slept in your car last night, you slept in Walmart's parking lot, whatever. And so they wasn't looking at the fact that this is a mom with 6 kids. We can't realistically sleep in my car. We have to be somewhere where there's some sort of roof, even if it's a half of a roof. But we need this FEMA trailer. And so we moved into the FEMA trailer. And once I moved into the FEMA trailer, I also learned that any other assistance that you're applying for, that FEMA trailer, the amount of that trailer, the cash value of the trailer, takes away from any other cash assistance that you get from FEMA. So if you've turned in, you know, like all of these things that you've lost or whatever, No, they said that falls under, this trailer is worth $30,000. So that's the cap, and that's what you get. You live in this trailer until we say you can't live in it anymore. And so people who lost everything like me, when it's time to move out of the trailer, now you're starting with nothing. So you had people who were in that trailer they had to move out by October. When they moved out, and then there was that need again. You know, that was still directly related to disaster, but because FEMA had felt like they met the need or their hands were tied and this is all they could do, they couldn't provide people with refrigerators or with beds or with any of the other needs, essentials that you need for a home. And so again, Vessel Project stepped in and people were like, I need a bed, and we provided it. We provided refrigerators and stoves and, you know, sofas and whatever else people needed for their homes.
Lauren, what is striking hearing this is that some of the folks that you talked to, when they spoke with FEMA, they were supposed to be staying in their damaged homes. That was what FEMA wanted to compensate them for. It sounds like there was just a Byzantine set of rules that FEMA was operating by. How did you navigate that as a reporter? What did you learn about how FEMA thinks about providing aid in the aftermath of these?
What I learned, and I think that you found also in your interactions, is that there are a lot of people who work for FEMA that really do want to help you. And when the rubber hits the road, their hands are totally tied.
Right.
There is a limit past which they cannot make the rules bend, and they can't break them either. So yeah, I spoke with this woman, Alexis Sheridan. Her story is all over the first episode of the show, and Roishetta helped Alexis and her fiance a lot. Alexis was pregnant when I met her and living in a tent, and FEMA had rejected her request for help with rent because Alexis wasn't renting a house. And it was this terrible chicken and the egg situation where she had to prove she had a home to rent in order to qualify for the help she needed to get a house to rent. So I spoke with a lot of FEMA employees, and you have as well, just to get a sense of basically how much flexibility there really is in the system. And what we found is that if FEMA rejects you for a reason that feels wrong or totally just out of whack with reality, you can appeal. But the appeals process is totally stacked against people of color, people who do not speak English as a first language. If you are white or wealthy, you are way more likely to succeed and to get FEMA to reverse its decision and help you. And that, that doesn't feel like a fair or just recovery system to a lot of the people who need it the most.
Right.
So from this grassroots mutual aid effort that you started, you have now gone on a journey since, and you've become an organizer, community outreach specialist, climate activist. Tell me about what has happened since you started the Vessel Project.
Right. So in working with so many different people in the communities from all walks of life, Alexis, for example, who had so many different things stacked against her already. And we already know that a lot of the times the people that are most impacted by these disasters are folks who are already impacted by everything else. You know, these are disadvantaged, low-income, BIPOC communities who bear the burden of everything from no health care to food deserts to very little access to public transportation and so on and so forth. And so when you put those people in a situation where they're in the midst of a global pandemic and they're hit by several disasters, it's just really hard for them to pull themselves up. They were barely floating before any of those things happened. And so in trying to navigate that and get people back to where they just, I started thinking if I think like FEMA just wants to get you back to where you were, but for some of those people, again, they were just barely floating. So we needed to get them just above where they were to get them, to push them, propel them forward. And so I ran into issues with the criminal justice system, you know, people who had been living in their low-income Section 8 HUD apartments for 10, 15 years, qualified for it 15 years ago and could live in it and was on a fixed rate rent, now couldn't qualify for HUD because maybe they, you know, had a misdemeanor that happened within the time that they lived there, and now that's on their record and they can't qualify for this program anymore, or they can't move in this apartment. Even though they committed that crime or they did whatever it is that they did, it was not their fault that they were displaced from their home where they had lived and could have continued to live forever if this storm wouldn't have happened. So there was no program to help those type of people to get into a home. And so I ended up going back to school to get my master's in criminal justice just to learn how to navigate the criminal justice system, because I was running into that issue with so many people. You know, people who, one guy who called us for help, he had been, you know, on a regular custody schedule with his child, and the mom went and reported that he was now homeless. He lost his home in the hurricane. And she went and reported that, and then they removed that custody until he had a safe place for his child to come and visit. And so we had to go and pay for some legal assistance for him. So it was just all these things that were stacked up against folks who were in recovery, who were in these positions due to these storms that had happened back to back in their community and had taken everything from them. And so, you know, I was like, what is the root cause of this? What is the center? How do I trace? What is the life cycle of what is going on? And, you know, and climate change is what, you know, that was the answer. And then I was like, well, but what's fueling climate change in Southwest Louisiana? What contributes to the warming of our climate? What is contributing to Gulf Coast erosion? And, you know, in Southwest Louisiana, everybody loves to come there for Mardi Gras and for our crawfish. Or either you all go to New Orleans, because some of you may think that New Orleans is a state. It's a city. Lake Charles is also in the state of Louisiana. But, and so I was like, you know, what's happening? Years before the storm had hit, there were reports of, you know, not as much crawfish crops and not as much crabs and shrimp and fish, and then we had a fish eating advisory. And so I started looking at all those pieces, and I was like, wait a minute. When people think of Southwest Louisiana, the reason why they don't come here, the reason why they don't care about us, and Reddit proved it, because if you went to Reddit, they were like, oh, well, it's good for them. All they want is oil and gas industry. I was like, it's these petrochemical and oil and gas facilities that we're surrounded by. There was fueling the climate change here. There was fueling these hurricanes and making them stronger, because those facilities are building on our wetlands, which is our natural storm surge protection. They're building on our cheniers. They're building on, you know, along our coastline. And one of the facilities that was just approved by FERC is right on the trash line of where Hurricane Laura ended up. So when you think about it, if we still had all that natural wetland that was put there to protect us from those storm surges, a lot of that devastation wouldn't have happened. So how do you stop it from happening so that you can help these people who are still in recovery? You fight climate change, you fight big oil and gas. And so that's how I became an organizer, and that's how I started, you know, and then I just kept looking for the root of the problem and trying to trace their life cycle. And it went all the way to plastics and plastics pollution, and how is that tied to the oil and gas industry? And so
you started at the very surface level of the crisis, and you went all the way down to the root level. So let me step back. Thank you. And let me step back and ask you a larger question. Mm-hmm. So, you know, from this, we spent, my team spent much of last year working with the New York Times Magazine on an episode, on an issue about the living in an age of constant disaster. Mm-hmm. That we have to stop thinking about disaster as something that happens occasionally, and think of it as we are living in a state of disaster, and how do we operate differently? So what do you think, having navigated both the close to the ground level of this and then gone all the way down to root causes, what do you think needs to change about our governmental response and our culture?
Well, I think what needs to change about our governmental response, at first I thought it was bringing the government to the people. You know, I don't know if you all know that I brought FERC down to Southwest Louisiana and Southeast Texas, gave them a tour, let them meet some folks that live in those communities that live very close to industry. They sat down, they ate with people, conversed with them, heard their stories, and then they went back to their little offices, and they all 5 approved Commonwealth, which is a massive LNG facility in the community. So at first I thought that was the answer, like they're not seeing the people enough. They're not close enough to the problem. And then I realized, no, it's not bringing FERC to the community, it's bringing the community to FERC. And so I think when you go into the frontline communities and you find the people on the ground that's working, the people that are closest to the problem have the solutions. And so we need those people at the table making the decisions, telling, the government what is best for their communities, what they need in their communities, what they don't want in their communities, and we need to stop making the decisions for those people. And when we find those people in the community who are most often not paid or underpaid or struggling to live in their community themselves, we need to support them, provide them with resources, and pay them. There's this stigma that, oh, you're only fighting climate change because you get paid for it, or you're only helping people because you get paid for it. We still have to survive and live in that community because of the way that the system is set up. And so we need to find those grassroots community organizing people who have made very impactful changes, who right now the EPA has a hearing going on with this methane rule that they're trying to pass, and I'm going to be testifying on that later tonight. But we need to find those community people and get them to testify, get them at these hearings, get them to write comments, and so that their voices are heard. And it's no longer trying to get, the White House to the community, but getting the community to the White House. And I think that's what's going to impact the changes, the people on the ground who's going to make the changes happen.
And Lauren, I think I will ask you one last question before we wrap, which is, what do you think, we have here residents and leaders from a variety of different communities across the southern United States. What do you think that other communities could learn from what you witnessed in Lake Charles?
Sure. I know that we're having a lot of conversations about what makes a place resilient. And one of the first things I learned in going to Lake Charles and talking with people like Roishetta is that resilience is kind of like a dirty word.
We don't want to be resilient.
Yeah, it puts a lot of burden on people who, kind of have the least resources, the least to give. I also walked away feeling really concerned about the way communities have to disperse after a disaster. There's a reason why when that ice storm hit the southern U.S., Roishetta was hearing from people scattered to Georgia and Mississippi and Texas. We know that it is harder for people to bounce back from the next disaster if they're uprooted from their communities, from their neighbors, from their friends. It takes a lot, and those folks were lucky, I think, to eventually find their way back to you and connect with you and get assistance from you. So, we're starting to have conversations about relocation, which places are deserving of being saved, how do we relocate communities out of areas that we know are likely to be struck again by a flood or a hurricane or whatever comes next. I think that we need to give a little more attention to the connections that exist in a community and what we're going to do with those if we expect people to disperse.
Should I ask you the same question? What do you think local community leaders in other places should take away from what you have experienced and done?
Yes, I think local community leaders, activists, big green groups, environmental organizations, private sector, public sector, we have to put people first. We have to put families before funds, people before policies, and we have to start looking into frontline communities and frontline community leaders and joining them, not parachuting in whenever there's a disaster and saying, oh, let me hand you all out some bottles of water, and then leaving whenever the spotlight or the newsman leaves, or whenever it's no longer a popular topic. But really putting programs and system in place in those communities so that they can be sustainable once that person is gone, once that organization is gone. And also learning from each disaster. There's no cookie cutter disaster. Port Arthur is still recovering from Hurricane Harvey, but we know Houston got money. But what communities in Houston got the money? And did that money that came to Texas, did it get to Port Arthur? And so looking at those things and how are we tracing this money that's supposed to be for recovery and making sure that that money is getting to our most vulnerable citizens, as Dr. Bullard said when he was on the panel earlier. So I think the discussion is deeper, and what we need to be looking at is the intersectionality of all of these issues. What's at the core? And what's at the core of all of the issues that we face and what's driving it all is race And we're so afraid to put race into the discussion, but race is what got us here. And so race is what's going to get us away from it. So we need more BIPOC people at the table, more frontline folks at the table. We need to start going into frontline communities and talking with them and putting real sustainable solutions in those communities.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you'll be around for a while. We don't have a chance to get questions from the crowd, but I'm sure many of you can follow up with our panelists after our talk to ask all the questions I'm sure you've got. Meanwhile, thank you very much for your work and for sharing your insights with us today.
Thank you.